At 3 a.m., they came with bulldozers to erase a neighborhood and build a casino on stolen ground. What they didn't know, the man they displaced once trained a world champion named Arnold. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. They came at 3 a.m., not with sirens or searchlights, but with bulldozers, riot shields, and the kind of silence that means everything has already been decided. No one knocked. No one warned. There were only voices on loudspeakers echoing through dark alleyways. This is a lawful operation. You must vacate immediately. Within minutes, fences fell. Wooden porches cracked under steel treads. Windows shattered before anyone was fully awake. It wasn't a war zone. It was worse because it was legal. Families were dragged from their homes in thin blankets and confusion. A mother screamed for her son, who was still inside. A boy ran out with a school backpack, tripping over his own shoes. Cameras were banned. Cell towers mysteriously slowed. Those who filmed from their balconies saw their footage disappear from the cloud hours later. The few journalists who remained in town were told this was a routine infrastructure redevelopment. But the people knew what it really was: erasure. A 72-year-old woman named Evelyn stood in front of a rust-stained gate, clutching a photo of her late husband, refusing to move. A riot officer told her this was her last warning. She didn't blink. She whispered something. No one heard what. Then the baton came down. Her body crumpled onto the sidewalk. The officer stepped around her and kept going. By sunrise, 7 blocks were flattened. Fences wrapped the perimeter with plastic banners that read, "Coming soon Atlantic Terra Casino and Retail District." Where once stood a community center, a row of one-story homes, and a boxing gym with faded blue walls, now stood dust, mud, and silence. What no one mentioned in the press briefings was that this exact block once held the Grunwald Community Strength Center, built in 2005 and named after Jacob Grunwald, a coach, a mentor, and a man who once trained a boy from Austria to believe he was stronger than circumstance. That boy had become Mr. Olympia. Later, a global movie star. Later still, a governor. But none of that was part of the story anymore. Not here. Not now. The legal justification for the erasure came from the 2022 Urban Reclamation Act, a quiet piece of legislation that allowed municipalities to seize underutilized land for strategic economic growth. The definition of underutilized had quietly changed in a late-night vote no one reported. Now, any structure with more than 51% infrastructure degradation could be condemned. According to the report, the old boxing gym had 53% roof wear and a cracked west wall. That was all it took. The residents fought back in the ways they could: petitions, letters, protests, but all of it was ignored. One by one, those who spoke out lost their jobs, their welfare checks, or their rental protections. A school teacher who questioned the project during a parent meeting was suddenly transferred to a rural district with no warning. One father who tried to file an injunction was publicly labeled as a public disruption risk and had his business license revoked. Resistance was no longer criminalized. It was simply made impossible. And then there was a silence, the kind that grew like mold. Neighbors stopped talking to each other. Some moved away without saying goodbye. Others stayed, but kept their heads down, eyes away from cameras. The community wasn't just being dismantled in concrete. It was being unraveled in trust. Connie Grunwald, Jacob's daughter, was one of the last still fighting. Her father had passed away a decade ago, but his legacy lived in the training center and in every kid who once learned to box, to breathe, to believe. She had tried to stop the city's move, citing ownership records, letters from donors, even a 2005 agreement signed by a former governor, but the council never responded. They claimed the original documentation was missing from the archive. Connie had no lawyers, no money, and no leverage, but she had one thing left: the truth. That morning, after watching Evelyn's body disappear in an unmarked ambulance, Connie returned to her father's former office, a small, dust-choked room behind the gym's back wall. She unlocked a drawer no one had touched in years. Inside was a yellow folder, old and frayed. On its front was a single word in thick black ink: Arnold. No one knew yet, But somewhere across the country, in a city still asleep, a man who once owed his spine to a coach named Jacob Grunwald was reading an article at a gas station. A folded newspaper, half soaked in coffee, sat in his hand. The image on the front showed a demolition site, and in the corner, almost invisible, stood a woman holding a photograph. Her last name was one he hadn't heard in years. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He simply picked up his phone and asked a single question to the man on the other end. Do we still have the paperwork from 2005? He hadn't seen that name in over 2 decades. Grunwald. The letter stared back from the grainy newspaper, like a whisper from a forgotten life. Arnold sat still, the coffee in his cup untouched, the gas station humming around him as if in another world. He held the photo close to his eyes. The resolution was poor, but he knew that face. Not the woman. He didn't know her yet. But the man in the picture frame. She clutched her chest. That man once told a teenage Arnold to stop looking at the floor when he failed, and start looking at who he could become. The name Jacob Grunwald wasn't just part of his past. It was the reason he had won. Jacob didn't just teach him to lift weights. He taught him how to carry silence with strength, how to speak without needing applause. Jacob had once let him sleep on the floor of a gym office in Graz when he had nowhere else to go. The same man who gave Arnold his first pair of lifting shoes had now been reduced to a faded portrait, held by a daughter being evicted in silence. Arnold set the newspaper down, reached into the glove box of his truck, and pulled out an old notepad. He flipped to a dog-eared page labeled Legacy Projects. His pen moved slowly, writing just one word, Grunwald. Then he turned the key in the ignition and left the city behind him. Hours later, in a private legal office with windows overlooking the Pacific, Arnold sat across from a man he hadn't seen in 15 years. David Cho was a retired property law specialist who had helped Arnold establish a series of nonprofit civic centers in the early 2000s. Now in his 60s, Cho still wore the same square glasses and carried himself with a quiet calm, as if every sentence had already been weighed before spoken. Arnold said nothing at first. He simply placed a yellow folder on the desk. Cho opened it slowly, with the care of someone unsealing a will. Inside were copies, some faded, some clean, of the 2005 agreement signed between the Grunwald family and the town of Edgewater, where Jacob's training center had been built. Page 3 was the key. Cho tapped it gently. Clause 12C, he said. The reversionary interest. Arnold nodded once. The clause was brief but powerful. It stated that if the land donated for the Grunwald Community Strength Center ever ceased to be used for public education or athletic purposes, ownership would automatically revert to the legal heir of Jacob Grunwald. Cho leaned back in his chair. They never avoided this, he said. They tried to bury it, maybe, but legally it still stands. Arnold didn't smile. He only asked, "What happens if they've already started demolition?" Cho replied, "Then they're trespassing." The next step wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a press conference or a fiery speech. Arnold didn't walk into a courtroom or post online. Instead, he sat in a plain room and wrote 3 letters by hand, one to the city council, one to the county land registrar, and one to Connie Grunwald. In each, he enclosed a copy of Clause 12C and a notarized affidavit, confirming that Connie was a rightful heir. He didn't sign them as a celebrity. He signed as a donor, a witness, and a student. 2 days later, Connie stood in the ruins of the community center, surrounded by dust and splinters, holding a sealed envelope she had just received. Her hands trembled as she read the letter inside. There were no promises, no apologies, just the law, just proof, just dignity, delivered in a plain manila envelope. That same day, an email arrived at the office of the Edgewater City Attorney. It was a legal notice of reversion, citing breach of contract and invalidation of eminent domain. The subject line read, Notice of Title Reversion Parcel 13A Grunwald Trust. Inside the city's planning department, confusion turned quickly to panic. Staff pulled old files, compared signatures, and made frantic calls. One deputy reviewed internal memos from years ago and found a line in red ink, Grunwald Clause Unresolved Recommend Future Review. That review never happened. At the end of the day, the city attorney stood before the mayor and 3 council members and said 2 words they didn't want to hear. He owns it. Not Arnold, not some corporation, but Connie, and by extension, the memory they had tried to bulldoze. Across town, Connie returned to her father's study. She placed a letter from Arnold beside a dusty photo of Jacob coaching a group of kids. Then she opened a new drawer, pulled out a small camcorder, and set it on the table. She whispered to herself, "It's time." Arnold didn't wait for thanks. He didn't return calls. He simply got back in his truck and started driving. He knew this wasn't over. They would fight it, spin it, try to delay, but it didn't matter. The land had spoken, and it hadn't chosen the side of the powerful. It had remembered who it belonged to. The first sign of trouble wasn't the letter. It was the silence that followed it. Inside City Hall, inboxes went still. Calls stopped being returned. Meetings were postponed without explanation. The mood shifted from triumph to tension. What was supposed to be a groundbreaking week turned into a bureaucratic blackout. At the planning department, someone finally noticed a file stamped in red. Grunwald Clause Unresolved Future Legal Review Required. It had been buried in an annex folder attached to the original land donation. Nobody had ever opened it, because nobody thought they'd have to. After all, who reads condition from 20 years ago? But now, that one sentence, just 28 words, has frozen a $190 million project. The mayor called an emergency briefing behind closed doors. The city attorney showed up looking pale. He explained the clause in slow, quiet sentences. If it held up in court, and there was every indication it would, then the casino was already being built on land they didn't legally own. That meant the contractors were trespassing. The permits were void. And worst of all, the media didn't know yet. One council member asked who had discovered it. The attorney hesitated. The notice came from a nonprofit group in Sacramento. He left out that the envelope bore a small handwritten note on the back, in memory of Coach Grunwald. No signature. No return address. Just that. Across town, Connie sat at a small kitchen table with her father's old camcorder. She hadn't pressed a record yet. She didn't know what to say. Part of her didn't even believe what was happening. For years, her voice had bounced off walls no one listened to. Now it echoed in boardrooms, all because of a paragraph hidden in a file, and someone who remembered. Meanwhile, at the state land registrar's office, a junior clerk opened a legal confirmation request submitted the week prior. It included deed copies, an affidavit, and an attached audio message. This request supports a reversion of title on public trust property. Please process accordingly. The voice was calm, with a faint Austrian edge. The clerk didn't recognize it, but she followed protocol. By the next morning, the first official freeze order was issued. Construction crews were told to halt all activity, pending review. The site manager argued. He waved a copy of the city's original permit, but the county officer shook his head. That paper's worthless if the land isn't yours. The machinery fell silent. For the first time in weeks, no concrete was poured. No walls were raised. Just dust. And waiting. The casino investors didn't stay quiet. They filed an emergency motion with the court, demanding a fast-track hearing to assert ownership. Their lawyers called the clause irrelevant, antiquated, non-binding. But in a deposition behind closed doors, the city planner admitted that yes, the clause had existed. Yes, it had been flagged. And no, it had never been addressed. The judge ordered a 72-hour delay on all development. It wasn't a ruling, but it was a signal. And to the community that had been silenced for months, it felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. Inside a small law office uptown, Arnold watched a live stream of court decision from a laptop. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded once and closed the screen. Then he opened another folder. This one wasn't legal. It was personal. Old photographs of the training center being built. Kids lifting homemade weights. Jacob in a worn-out tank top, teaching posture with a broomstick. Behind each image, there was a reason, and none of them had to do with casinos. Later that day, someone posted a photo online. It showed a construction site, empty and still, with yellow tape surrounding the lot. The caption read, "Justice sleeps here." The post went viral in under an hour. Local reporters began digging. They found court records, donation logs, tax filings. One of them connected the nonprofit's funding to a defunct civic alliance once supported by Arnold Schwarzenegger. But nothing was confirmed. No interviews were granted. No photos released. When asked, Arnold's team responded with a single line: "He is not available for comment." The truth didn't need a face. It just needed a foundation. As the sun set over Edgewater, Connie finally pressed record. She looked into the lens, not as a victim, not as a politician, but as a daughter. She didn't talk about the land. She talked about her father, about the nights he trained kids for free, about how he kept the gym open late, so no child would have to go home afraid, about how she once asked him why he never left the neighborhood, and how he said, "Because you don't leave the people who made you who you are." That night, her video was shared hundreds of times, then thousands. It didn't ask for sympathy. It didn't point fingers. It just told the truth. And truth, like land, has a way of remembering who it belongs to. The town hall lights were brighter than usual. Extra security stood by the doors, their expressions unreadable. Rows of chairs had been rearranged for cameras, and nameplates gleamed like metals under the stage lights. A printed banner stretched across the back wall: Edgewater Revitalization Forum Community in Progress. But there were no community voices scheduled to speak. Outside, dozens of residents pressed against metal barricades. Some held signs that read, "We still live here," and "Progress without eviction." Others just stood, eyes fixed on the building like it had betrayed them. Most weren't allowed inside. Only registered guests were permitted entry, invitation only. The city had issued 72 guest passes. Not one had gone to a displaced family. Inside, the seats filled with developers, real estate executives, financial backers, and carefully chosen members of the press. The forum began with a polished video showcasing what the Edgewater Casino would bring: jobs, tax revenue, tourism. Slow-motion shots of happy families, fireworks over skyline renderings, aerial views of future hotels. The applause felt rehearsed. The mayor took the podium, speaking with the cadence of a campaign speech. He praised the city's bold vision. He thanked Atlantic Terra for its investment. He called the resistance understandable but misinformed. He never said the word eviction. Not once. Connie watched from the curb outside. She wasn't even on the entry list. She knew because she had tried. Twice. Now she stood with the rest, listening to muffled speeches through thick glass. She didn't yell. She didn't wave a sign. She just stood still, arms crossed, face steady. Behind her, someone muttered, "It's all decided already." And they were right. The panel that followed the mayor included developers, economists, a university spokesperson, even a tourism consultant. Not one resident. Not one teacher. Not one displaced voice. The moderator never mentioned the court delay or the title clause, as if it didn't exist. But beneath the polished surface, the cracks were spreading. On the second row, a journalist from the local station scrolled through her phone. She had just received an anonymous file drop: court documents, a scanned deed, and a memo from the planning department dated 3 years ago, clearly warning of the Grunwald clause. The memo had been ignored. She looked up at the stage. None of the speakers knew yet that this was already out. Backstage, a young city aide stared at a text message glowing on his screen. It read, "Check live stream comments." He opened the feed on his tablet. At first, it looked normal. But then he saw the chat, hundreds of messages flooding in from viewers across the city. Whereas Connie, "Let the residents speak. Clause 12C is real." "You're lying." The aide looked around. No one else had noticed. Yet, and then, without warning, the screen behind the panel began to glitch. A flicker, a pause, a change. The promotional video vanished. In its place, a still frame, a woman standing in front of a demolished building, holding an old photo of her father. Connie. There was no sound, just that image. It stayed on screen for 10 full seconds before cutting to black. The moderator froze mid-sentence. Someone backstage killed the projector. The panel, shifted in their seats. Murmurs spread like smoke. The mayor stepped back to the podium, tried to regain control. He laughed awkwardly, called it a technical error, promised the floor would continue. But the illusion had cracked. Cameras zoomed tighter. Eyes narrowed. The audience was no longer leaning forward in anticipation. They were watching in judgment. Outside, Connie didn't move. She had seen it too. Someone had made sure she was in the room, whether the city allowed her or not. And somewhere in the building, a quiet man in a dark jacket sat in the very last row, unnoticed. He didn't take notes, didn't speak, but his eyes never left the stage. When the banner behind the mayor fell slightly askew, when the moderator stumbled over a prepared answer, when the applause came half a second too late, he noticed. Arnold had seen forums like this before. Big words, no voices. Applause, no listening. He didn't come to interrupt. He came to observe. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let a lie collapse under its own weight. As the forum dragged on, more texts arrived. Journalists in the room began to stand. One asked, politely but firmly, if the city had reviewed the 2005 clause. The mayor hesitated, said they would issue a statement later. Another asked why no residents had been invited to speak. Another asked if the building was being constructed on land not legally owned by the city. The mayor's answers grew shorter, less confident. The panel started checking their watches. The moderator skipped an entire segment. And somewhere behind the stage, a young technician watched the chat stream scroll faster than he could read. The people were no longer outside. They were everywhere. The auditorium was quiet when he stood up, not because anyone noticed him, but because the room had already grown uneasy. The questions from the press were growing sharper. The answers from the mayor are more evasive. The illusion was cracking. And in that silence, a man who had not registered, not spoken, and not taken a seat near the front rose from the shadows of the back row and began to walk forward. No one said his name, but as he moved, a few turned. A ripple passed through the air. Not recognition, just instinct. Some people carry presence the way others carry volume. And Arnold didn't need to speak for the room to shift. He reached the front row and stood near the side of the stage, just out of frame from the main camera. The mayor noticed him. For a second, he faltered in his speech, eyes darting left. Then he cleared his throat and tried to continue. But Arnold didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He just waited. It was the moderator who finally broke. "Sir, you're not scheduled to speak." Arnold nodded once. Calm, steady. Then he said, without raising his voice, "I don't need to speak. I need to read something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't new. It was worn, the edges curled, like it had been carried for years. "I submitted this clause to the city council 20 years ago," he said, holding it between two fingers. "It's Clause 12C. It states that if the land donated for community use is repurposed for private development, ownership reverts to the original grantor's heirs." He paused. "As of last week, that transfer complete. The property no longer belongs to the city." The moderator stammered. The mayor stepped forward. "This is not the time or place." Arnold turned to him. "You made it the place where you broke the contract." A murmur swept through the audience. Some reached for their phones. Others sat frozen. The panel of developers began whispering among themselves. The moderator tried to regain control, but the room had shifted. Arnold didn't stay long. He didn't deliver a speech. He didn't raise his voice or point fingers. He simply handed the document to the court officer who had been assigned to monitor the forum and turned to leave. But just as he stepped away, a voice called out from the audience. "Why now?" It was a student reporter from the local college paper. Young, brave, unfiltered. Arnold stopped. He looked back. "Because you've forgotten what this land was. And someone has to remind you." Then he left the room. But the twist didn't end there. Minutes later, as the panel tried to recover, the screen behind them flickered again. This time, it wasn't a glitch. It was a video, a handheld camcorder recording. Grainy but clear, it showed a council member from 3 years ago, seated in a private office, speaking to a developer. The voice was low, but distinct. "They'll never find it," the man said. "We buried that clause under 3 annexes. It'll never resurface." The developer asked, "What if it does?" The council member laughed. "You think someone's going to dig through a decade-old archive for a gem? Come on." The audio cut. Then the screen went black. Silence swallowed the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Somewhere in the back, Connie stood up. She didn't walk to the stage. She didn't need to. Her presence now said enough. The mayor tried to dismiss the video as edited. The moderator tried to resume the next question. But the press had already left their seats. Microphones were raised. Phones were filming. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about a lie. And the lie had a timestamp. By the end of the forum, legal representatives were already receiving formal notices. The county registrar confirmed that the title had indeed reverted. Construction companies began pulling equipment off the site by nightfall. Journalists followed the paper trail. And for the first time in years, they printed every word. Arnold didn't return to the stage. He was already gone. But his absence now carried weight. Not the weight of fame or power, but of something deeper. The weight of memory. Of promises kept. Of a man who didn't come to win, but to restore something quietly stolen. And all it took was one sentence written 20 years ago. And someone who never forgot it. Nobody expected her to stand. Not here. Not now. Not in this way. But when the room held its breath in the final seconds of silence, just before the forum collapsed completely, it was her voice that broke through. Not loud, not angry, just steady. "I have something to say." The microphone wasn't handed to her. She walked down the side aisle, not toward the stage, but toward the front row, where members of the press now stood uninvited. One of them stepped aside and held out his mic without a word. He had seen her before. A few of them had. Some vaguely recognized her as a former junior reporter. Let go during the early days of the project. Others remembered her face from a story that never aired. She looked straight ahead. No script. No notes. "My name is Elise Grunwald. I was a local field producer for Channel 9. I covered community redevelopment stories. That was my job, until I found something I wasn't supposed to." The room didn't move. Not yet. "I shot a segment about the early demolitions in this neighborhood. I interviewed families. I filmed the gym before it was torn down. And I recorded something else. Something that didn't make the cut." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a flash drive, held it up, small, quiet, like it didn't carry decades of weight. Then she handed it to the technician running the projector. No one told him to play it. No one needed to. The lights dimmed again. The video began with footage from a quiet street at dawn. A line of riot police. A bulldozer. A woman screaming. Then the camera pulled back to reveal the green facade of the old training center. The sign half broken, but still legible. Grunwald Community Strength. Then the audio shifted. A man's voice. Calm, quiet, calculating. "This structure protected under conditional grant law," he said. "You need to process an override." A second voice replied. "Already done. Signed it last night. Technically, we're not evicting. We're transitioning the property." Elisa's voice from behind the camera asked, "But doesn't the clause still stand?" There was silence. Then laughter. "They'll never check. Nobody checks." The video was cut to black. The silence after was not the kind that invites applause. It was the kind that unsettles. The kind that lingers like smoke. The kind that leaves no room for doubt. Elise didn't speak again. She just stepped back, let the stillness hold, and returned to her seat. The technician sat frozen, hands hovering over the control panel. No one gave an order to resume the forum, because there was nothing left to resume. The moderator attempted to speak, but choked on his first word. A council member reached for his phone. The mayor had already disappeared behind the stage. And on every news outlet live-streaming the forum, the chat erupted with one word: fraud. Connie sat still in the audience, tears in her eyes, not from pain, but from something harder to name, a kind of release, a kind of restoration. Outside, the crowd had grown. Screens were being held above heads. streaming the feed. When the video ended, people didn't cheer. They didn't chant. They just stood still, many of them crying, some holding hands. The woman who had once blocked a bulldozer now sat in a folding chair, clutching the photo of her husband. Her hands didn't shake. Inside, a soft voice broke the stillness one last time. It belonged to an elderly man near the back, once custodian at the gym. He had said nothing for years. But now he simply asked, "Does that mean we get it back?" No one answered, but everyone knew. That night, local news stations ran the story under the headline, "Whistleblower exposes illegal eviction dealings in casino project." Elise never gave interviews. Connie didn't speak to cameras. Arnold didn't issue statements. They didn't have to. By morning, a legal injunction had frozen the remaining funding to Atlantic Terra. The city attorney resigned quietly. Several council members faced ethics investigations, and the state announced it would conduct a full review of all redevelopment approvals issued over the past 5 years. But none of that mattered as much as what happened inside the old gym building. It wasn't much, just walls and dust and silence. But for the first time in months, its door was unlocked. Connie walked through it slowly, followed by Elise and a few of the children who used the train there. They didn't speak. They just stood in the middle of the main floor, under a hole in the roof that let in the morning light. And then, one by one, they began to clean. No cameras, no music, just brooms, old rags, and the sound of breath returned to a place that had almost forgotten it knew how to hold life. It didn't happen overnight. The lawsuits dragged on for weeks. The headlines faded. The cameras moved to other towns, other stories. But something had already shifted, not just in the law books or property records, but in the people. They no longer whispered. They spoke, not in outrage, but in ownership. The gym reopened with no ribbon cutting. No press release. Just a door left open and a new coat of paint on the walls. The sign above the entrance had been repaired, not replaced. The old letters still read, Grunwald Community Strength. The name was never the problem. Inside, it didn't look like a modern training center. It still smelled of dust and iron, but someone had fixed the lights. The bags hung again. The floor had been swept. On the far wall, a framed photo of Jacob coaching a teenage Arnold had been mounted, next to a handwritten quote. Strength means showing up, even when the world tells you not to. One afternoon, Connie stood beside that wall, watching two boys spar with oversized gloves. She didn't call out. She just observed, nodding when one of them finally stepped back and smiled. That was enough. Later that week, the town council quietly approved a motion to restore the property's zoning designation as community trust. It passed unanimously. No one gave a speech. Not even the mayor, who had since returned with less volume and more listening. Arnold never came back to the gym. Not publicly. But some said they saw him one early morning, just after sunrise, sitting in a parked truck across the street, watching the lights flicker on inside. No one approached him. No one took a picture. That was never the point. In a letter Connie found weeks later, no envelope, just left tucked behind the office door, there was a single sentence written in black ink. You taught them more than I ever could. It was unsigned, but she didn't need a name. By the end of that month, the city quietly announced it was withdrawing from all pending private redevelopment contracts on public land. No grand apology, just a printed bulletin on their website, and a link to a public comment forum. For once, people used it, not just to protest, but to propose. Students submitted ideas for after-school programs. A local boxing coach offered to volunteer 3 nights a week. A retired teacher sent in a plan for a free adult literacy class. And from that broken building, a new structure began to rise, one built not from cement and steel, but from time, trust, and memory. Elise returned to Channel 9, not to work, but to deliver her final report. She left a flash drive on the editor's desk. No introduction, no demand, just a label, footage July-October. The network never aired it, but someone uploaded it anyway. The video didn't go viral. It didn't need to. A week later, a high school senior who had watched the clip walked into the gym and asked if she could volunteer. She didn't want to fight. She wanted to film, That was how the archive started. Not with a plan, but with a camera. She interviewed every coach, every kid, every janitor who had stayed. They didn't talk about loss. They talked about why they returned. And those stories were printed on a wall near the entrance under the words, "This is not a comeback. This is where we always were." And quietly, just outside the main office, a small plaque was drilled into the brick. Simple metal, clean font. It read, "In memory of Jacob Grunwald, in honor of those who never stopped showing up. Donated anonymously, 2005. No further details. No spotlight, but the ones who knew didn't need it.